In the summer of 1967, Fred Gardner arrived in San Francisco with the Vietnam War weighing heavily on his mind. Gardner was 25 years old, a Harvard graduate and a freelance journalist for a number of major publications. He was attracted to Northern California's mix of counterculture and radical politics, and hoped to become more actively involved in the movement to end the war. He was particularly interested in the revolutionary potential of American servicemen and couldn't understand why anti-war activists and organizers weren't paying more attention to such a powerful group of potential allies. Ever since completing a 2-year stint in the Army Reserves in 1965, Gardner had been closely watching the increasing instances of military insubordination, resistance, and outright refusal that were accompanying the war's escalation. From the case of the Fort Hood 3G.I.S. arrested in 1966 for publicly declaring their opposition to the war and refusal to deploy, to the case of Howard Levy, an Army dermatologist who refused his assignment to provide medical training for Special Forces troops headed to Vietnam, it was clear that the Army was fast becoming the central site of an unprecedented uprising. By 1967, the G.I. movement was capturing national headlines. And it wasn't just the war that was aggravating American servicemen. The military's pervasive racial discrimination, unequal opportunities for promotion, unfair housing practices, persistent harassment, and abuse fueled increasing outrage among black G.I.S. as the war progressed. Influenced by the civil rights and black liberation movements, black soldiers participated in widespread and diverse acts of resistance throughout the Vietnam era. Racial tensions were particularly high in the Army, where a vast majority of draftees were being sent, and where evasion, desertion, and insubordination rates among black G.I.S. exploded in the war's later years. An anti-war movement in the military was beginning to take shape, with black soldiers often its vanguard. As Gardner sat in the radical coffee houses of San Francisco's North Beach neighborhood that summer, he thought about the explosive power of servicemen turning against the war and wondered how that power could be supported and nurtured by the civilian anti-war movement. Most of all, he wanted to find a way to reach out to disaffected young G.I.S., to show them that there was a whole community of anti-war activists and organizers who were on their side. He finally settled on an idea: opening a network of youth culture-oriented coffee houses, just like the ones in North Beach, in towns outside military bases around the country. In January 1968 he did just that, traveling with a fellow activist, Donna Mickelson, to Columbia, SC, home of Fort Jackson, one of the Army's largest training bases and the crown jewel of the state's many military installations. The UFO Coffee House, decorated with rock and roll posters donated from the San Francisco promoter Bill Graham, quickly became a popular hangout for G.I.S. and a target of significant hostility from military officials, city authorities, and outraged local citizens. "It's a sore spot in our craw," a Columbia official said. The coffee house was located just off base, out of the military's reach but close enough for soldiers to visit during their free time, places where active duty servicemen, veterans, and civilian activists could meet to plan demonstrations, publish underground newspapers and work to build the nascent peace movement within the military. By the summer of 1968, major anti-war organizations took notice of the controversy the UFO was stirring up in Colombia and initiated a summer of support to organize funds for more coffeehouse projects around the country. In ensuing years, more than 25 G.I. coffee houses opened up near military bases in the United States and at a number of bases overseas. Over the course of 6 years, the Coffeehouse network would play a central role in some of the GI movement's most significant actions. At the Oleo Strut Coffeehouse in Killeen, Texas, local staff and G.I.S. mobilized to support the Fort Hood 43, a large group of black soldiers who were arrested at a meeting to discuss their refusal to deploy for riot control duty at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. A black veteran present at the meeting described its mood. A lot of black G.I.S. knew what the thing was going to be about, and they weren't going to go and fight their own people. Army authorities were caught off guard by the publicity the Coffeehouse brought to the case, and began to examine their strategies for dealing with political expression among the ranks. When 8 black G.I.S., each of them leaders of the group G.I.S. United Against the War in Vietnam, were arrested in 1969 for holding an illegal demonstration at Fort Jackson, the UFO Coffeehouse served as a local operations center, drumming up funds for lawyers and promoting the Fort Jackson 8 story to the national media. After GI and civilian activists created intense public pressure, officials quietly dropped all charges, signaling a shift in how the military would respond to soldiers expressing dissent. During its brief lifetime, the GI Coffeehouse network was subjected to attacks from all sides, investigated by the FBI and congressional committees, infiltrated by law enforcement, harassed by military authorities and, in a number of startling cases, terrorized by local vigilantes. In 1970, at the Fort Dix Coffeehouse project in Wrightstown, NJ, G.I.S. and civilians were celebrating Valentine's Day when a live grenade flew in through an open door. It exploded, seriously injuring 2 Fort Dix soldiers and a civilian. Another popular coffeehouse, the Covered Wagon in Mountain Home, Idaho, near a major Air Force base, was a frequent target of harassment by outraged locals, who finally burned it to the ground. Though their numbers dwindled as the war drew to a close in the mid-1970s, GI coffeehouses left an indelible mark on the Vietnam era. While popular mythology often places the anti-war movement at odds with American troops, the history of GI coffeehouses, and the GI movement of which they were a part, paints a very different picture. Over the course of the war, thousands of military service members from every branch, active duty G.I.S., veterans, nurses and even officers, expressed their opposition to American policy in Vietnam. They joined forces with civilian anti-war organizations that, particularly after 1968, focused significant energy and resources on developing social and political bonds with American service members. Hoping to build the resistance that was already taking shape in the Army, activists at GI coffeehouses worked directly with service members on hundreds of political projects and demonstrations. Despite relentless government surveillance, infiltration, and harassment. The unprecedented eruption of resistance and activism by American troops is critical to understanding the history of the Vietnam War. The GI movement and related phenomenon created a significant crisis for the American military, which feared exactly the kind of alliance between civilians and soldiers that Fred Gardner had in mind when he opened the first GI coffeehouse in 1968. Despite the extraordinary political and cultural impact that dissenting soldiers made throughout the Vietnam era, their voices have been nearly erased from history, replaced by a stereotypical image of loyal, patriotic soldiers antagonized and spat upon by ungrateful anti-war activists. In the decades since the war's end, countless Hollywood movies, books, political speeches, and celebrated documentaries have repeated this image, obscuring the war's deep unpopularity among the ranks and the countless ways that American troops expressed their opposition. This historical erasure serves a distinct purpose: casting dissent from wearing an anti-war t-shirt to kneeling during the national anthem as inherently disrespectful, even abusive, to American soldiers. A fuller reckoning with the era's history would begin by acknowledging the countless G.I.S. and civilians who stood together against the war. GI coffee houses are a vital window onto this history, showing us places where men and women came together to share their common revulsion at the war in Vietnam, and to begin organizing a collective effort to make it stop.